So our speaker today is Anna Fierst. She is well known to this building as well as to Washington. She served as president here of the WNDC from 2012 to 2015. She has been involved many different ways for many years before and after that. She is also one of the smallest members, the smallest member in a group photo of 4 generations of Anna Eleanors that is hanging in the oval foyer outside the second floor library in this building. And if I'm not mistaken, it is the Eleanor Roosevelt Library, right? That is so named in this building. She was introduced to the club by her mother, Anna Eleanor Roosevelt Seagraves, who served on the board of directors for many years and who realized one day that the club needed a new and different newsletter editor, and she thought of her daughter. So with her background in publication editing and marketing, as well as caring for her 2 young children, the position seemed perfect for her and was a perfect fit. Anna continued to serve in a variety of capacities here at the club, as well as holding a managerial role in running the Maryland Youth Orchestra and volunteering at the DC Youth Orchestra, which I'm thinking would be great programs for us as well. So please let us know. We would love to be more involved with that. She currently serves as chair of the board of directors for the Eleanor Roosevelt Center at Valkill, which is located in Hyde Park, New York, where their focus this year is on honoring the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Beyond that, as everybody in the nonprofit world knows and realizes, it's a major project to rebuild after the pandemic and get their programs going. And I think hopefully we're going to hear more about the programs that go on there as well. Both her son and daughter are now engaged in teaching professions, which is something that would have deeply pleased their great-grandmother, whose favorite role was as a teacher. Anna and her husband live in Bethesda, Maryland. We promoted this, although she lived in D.C. for many years as well, so we're going to claim her, too, as part of our legacy here in D.C. We promoted this as a moderated conversation, her talk. And it is going to be a moderated conversation, but not between she and I, but between you all and her. So I am going to be walking around kind of Oprah, Phil Donahue style with the microphone. And as she is talking, if you have questions and comments, please get my attention. And I will bring the mic around and we will have a conversation as we go forward. So we're very grateful to have her here today. And I turn the mic over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy, for that wonderful introduction. And I apologize if I didn't bring my hankies up here. I'm getting over a cold, so my voice is, I have my throat lozenges handy. So I'm going to put that down here. There is Kleenex, yes. Of course, I left it on the table. That's fine. I'm fine. Let me just say it's a privilege to be able to speak to this group, and Nelson was the one who brought me into this esteemed organization several years ago, and I realized as I was talking that I am behind on my dues. So the treasurer will be happy to send out another notice to me. It might have gone into my spam filter, so I apologize. But I'm very pleased to be able to bring a more family-based perspective on the extraordinary life of my great-grandmother and to cast more light on her life here in Washington, both before, during, and, of course, her occasional visits here after FDR's White House years. I'll also include a few vignettes from my mother's recollections of being a child in the White House. I'd like to mention that over the years, I've had a long time to see, at least in my grandmother's case, the difficulties of being the offspring of not just one, but 2 famous parents. So I can get to that probably. There may be some Q&A about that, but I can talk about that towards the end of this talk. Obviously, on that point, there are many advantages, but there is, as I've mentioned before in another question, this came up in another talk, there's a psychological price to be paid. So getting back to my mother, who is the one holding me in that picture that Cindy referred to, she'll be 96 next week, and she is Franklin and Eleanor's oldest grandchild. She was born in the double townhouses on East 65th Street that Sarah Delano had built for them for Franklin and Eleanor as a wedding gift, so around 1905. FDR was then, when my mother was born, the governor of New York, and his mother insisted that a home birth was safer because Lenox Hill Hospital, which is a highly esteemed hospital now, it started as established many decades before that as a hospital for German immigrants. So this was not considered, according to Sarah, an appropriate place for a young woman of her social standing to have a baby. So somehow it was safer to have a home birth, but whatever. My grandmother, just for the record, rebelled with the second child. So my mother, and with much reading besides, has helped me to understand the gradual evolution of her grandmother, who was born during the late Victorian era, and who naturally inherited many of the standard biases and assumptions of the late 19th century. This is a photo of Anna Rebecca Hall. It's an image of her mother who married Teddy Roosevelt's brother, Elliot. As you can imagine and see for yourself, she was considered a classic beauty and true to the standards of dress of the day, like every woman, especially one who she wasn't married yet. She had to wear a corset that must have made any movement beyond a walk an impossibility. So therefore, the fainting couch, I think, was invented for women like this. So Eleanor's relationship as a child and young woman to the TR side of the family was an important one, and an important one, I think, in a genetic sense, too, which I can tell you later. Her exposure to a brilliant sister of Theodore Roosevelt, in fact, the father of TR's the siblings and TR, the father always considered this woman the most brilliant child of the four of them, and lamented the fact that she was born a girl, because otherwise she would have been president. Yeah, she was another Anna, who was also called Bammy or Auntie Bi, and provided her, Eleanor that is, with an early model of a woman who had sharp opinions of her own, and freely told her brother her whole life when he was wrong about political policy, and who later actually became his closest advisor when he was president. To help him out in that advisory capacity, Bammy, or Auntie Bi, had for decades owned for decades a townhouse at 1733 N Street, which all of you here know where the Tabard Inn is, right? It was right almost next door to that, and it was here that Eleanor usually stayed in Washington. Unfortunately, of course, now it's the Courtyard Marriott. But anyway, in 1913, ER and Franklin rented this house from Bammy when FDR was appointed by Wilson to be the Assistant Secretary of the State. Assistant Secretary of the Navy. By 1917, the family had grown to its full complement, and they moved to a larger house at 2131 R Street, which is in the block just before it merges with Massachusetts Avenue. It's on the right. It is still there. The Embassy of Mali now occupies it, and there is, if you are walking down the street, there's a brass plaque by the front door. Because there are inquiring minds about this kind of thing, tongue-in-cheek, of course. It was here that Lucy Mercer was employed as Eleanor's social secretary. I think, in my opinion, biographers in the past have placed undue emphasis on the psychic break from this affair between Eleanor and her husband to claim that this is what really propelled her to needing a full and complete life of her own. However, it was less the affair, and I think biographers have now come around to this as a consensus, between FDR and Mercer, and more the grim situation with Franklin's polio that really projected his wife into political orbits of her own, and into these orbits throughout the 20s when she really began to get into political involvement, and created this astounding partnership that lasted until his death. So as we are talking about the same time period in an approximate sense, the early 20s, I want to mention her early involvement with the WNDC. So the club officially formed up in 1922 under the guidance of Florence Daisy Harriman. And just as we're pointing out photographs around the building, there is a wonderful shot of Daisy leading a suffrage parade down Fifth Avenue, which is in the reception room if you want to look at it. So the club's first home was 820 Connecticut Avenue, which of course is long gone. Daisy Harriman, who married a cousin of Averell Harriman, distant cousin I think, wrote to Eleanor in 1922, we're doing this, and we've won the vote, and we have to learn what to do with it. Eleanor, meanwhile, though, had moved back to North Carolina, to NYC in Hyde Park. And when she found out about this, and this was up and going, she immediately sent her $10 yearly non-resident dues back in from New York. And she remained a member, I want to say, until she passed away. Now, she was not in a position, and this was, the club was getting off the ground. They were trying to figure out where they were going to, permanent headquarters they'd move into. She was not in a position to help out financially or in any other ways in those early years of the 20s. Franklin's medical bills were really overwhelming at this point, with dealing with trying to get back and recover from a pretty severe attack of polio. As well, there was the ongoing struggle over his future and whether or not this viral disease had sealed him off from a life in the public eye. Because, you think about our attitude towards the handicapped, back physically disabled, it was a completely different, you were handicapped, sometimes people thought mentally as well. So while I know stories from this part of my great-grandmother's life and knew that she needed coaching as a political aide-de-camp, it still shocked me as a teenager when I didn't know what raising a family was all about, to learn that she played no role whatsoever in the suffrage movement in the decade leading up to 1920. Undoubtedly, with her social connections and her friends who were mostly of liberal persuasion, it would have been very easy to become involved on the sidelines, at least, of the suffrage movement, either through marches or fundraising, banner, you name it. But if you look at how her life was organized during the decade leading up to the 19th Amendment, the passage of it, she was completely mired down and exhausted by having 6 children within 10 years. One of them passed away at 9 months, but, still. Moving them between 3 and 4 houses, long-distance moves at that, trailed by staff and nannies, and all the while, and this is the sort of the typical Washington wife's duty, if you were here, you had to make daily social calls on all the other wives of Washington officialdom. So to put in modern terms, most of us have a passing knowledge of the arc of former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's life and her entrance into politics. And I've also always thought she would totally understand why Eleanor was not on the picket lines in that decade. But beyond the weight of domestic and wifely duties, there was also the underlying fear that any controversial political activities on her part, this is again during that World War I era when they were here, would damage his budding career. He was angling to get on the Democratic presidential ticket in 1920, and as we know, he did, as vice president, sort of a doomed ticket at that point. And a wife with a famous name in the headlines over a controversial matter, and those of you who know Washington history know it's a rather southern town. So you think about what this could have done, and to have that name, and TR's name was all over the place, and so it might have impeded his climb. And there was another practical problem, which is something that's interesting. He actually hated the practice of law, and that's what he was supposed to be doing to bring in the money. He basically scraped his way through Columbia Law School, and his main role as a partner at a white shoe law firm was to trade on the family name. He was the rainmaker. But they couldn't live on Sarah Delano's largesse any more than they already did. They obviously had a very costly lifestyle. So the money had to come from somewhere. And yet there was another problem, which one of those sort of indirect things you don't think about, but it has to do with cultural upbringings and assumptions. But this applied not only to Eleanor, but to many other young women of her social standing. And I'm referring here to the very controlled and rigid notions that surrounded their upbringings. What were proper public actions a woman might take were of huge concern back then, and much more than we can imagine from the vantage point of today. But by 1924, Franklin had determined that he was going to run for some office. And at some point, and he was still battling polio at this point, and not trying to figure out how he could fit back into public life. She was much more willing at that point to launch herself into campaigning, in this case for Al Smith, as governor of New York. And also, I think, to really say this is what, TR's side is, they're Republicans, whatever, but we're Democrats, and the Democrats were merging into a more, what we would call now liberal mainstream thought. So that's where she was going. Unfortunately, one aspect of this new independence caused a major rift between the TR and FD sides of the family. In a way, Eleanor, was in retribution mode for the failure of her father's relatives, Elliott Roosevelt's relatives, to support FDR during his bid for the vice presidency in 1920. She did not, that was a grudge and a big chip on her shoulder that she couldn't get any of them to join in. So she enlisted my grandmother, then a willowy, flaxen-haired 18-year-old, plus two pals who would have been Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman, and they started up Val Kill with her, who didn't mind wearing pants as well. And they literally tootled along, you'll see why I said literally in a minute, behind TR Jr.'s rallies across New York State. Eleanor had a big Buick touring car, I've seen pictures, it's huge, which somehow had yet not been driven into a tree. She was a great equestrian, but never a good driver. So one of her friends on this trip had this is Nancy Cook actually, had genuine mechanical and artistic skills. And she put together a giant papier-mâché teapot, which was strapped to the roof of the car. And somewhere out there is a picture of this car, but I can't find it. You say, well, why a teapot? Why not a giant lobster or something? So to put this in context, TR Jr. had been very remotely involved, and really remotely involved, in the infamous Teapot Dome scandal that unfolded under Harding's lackluster oversight. And it was a huge scandal in that time, like that people compare it to Watergate. And it involved oil reserves. So just remember that in Wyoming, illegally leased oil reserves. So Eleanor, though, said to herself, TR Jr. is doing this. I'm for Al Smith. I'm going to go have some fun with this. And so following up on each rally, at each little town of her cousin's tour, she and her friends would arrive with this rigged-up Buick, which when the dry ice was working would actually have steam just kind of coming out of the teapot. So, what a dramatic sight, right? But my grandmother's job, who was young and absolutely gorgeous, was to gaily sprint out of the car at each stop and rush over to spectators with cardboard fan-sized teapots like church fans. The New York Daily News turned this stunt into a headline, "Oil's Well, Miss Roosevelt chases teapot dome's bubbles." So I want to credit, I didn't know that story about my grandmother, who I was very close to as a child, and David Michaelis wrote that up, so I wanted to credit his research for that. So later, Eleanor would admit that this was a pretty rough stunt, and it did result in Al Smith winning by 100,000 votes, but who's counting? But there's a photo of all of them, this foursome, slouched up against this huge car in newsboy breeches, sensible shoes, thick tights, baggy sweaters, and they all look like teenagers out sort of playing hooky, but they were clearly having a blast. But to me, this stunt represents a person who has at last found her sense of personal agency. And yes, and saying, I can get a little wild out here, have some fun, make persuasive talk with spectators on my own, and not incidentally, wreak havoc on someone's campaign at the same time. In other words, the gloves were coming off finally. So as she continued her political education into the late 1920s, she visited the club and would stay overnight here. And just, to me, it seems all of us who've been members here for 20 or 30 years even, they used to rent rooms upstairs, right, Pat? Have some bedrooms, or Judy knows this. I don't know when we stopped doing this, but you could actually spend the night here. Her discussions with club leaders led her to publish articles in popular magazines such as Red Book, which, if you remember that magazine, you are dating yourself. But anyway, the article most quoted is titled, "Women Must Learn to Play the Game as Men Do." Her main point, right, I hear some affirmations out there, was that until women began raising money and being more assertive about this ability, men would refuse to take their vote seriously, would not appoint them to committees that had any weight or merit, and they would simply be relegated to the hospitality committees, no matter what it was. So in that article, she was really warning women to stop being naive about the ways and means by which they were boxed out of power. And I have to say, she had learned a lot of this from Franklin, who would have honest discussions with her about the ways of masculine politics. When he was governor, and he would have to, one of the things he did was primary things he tried to achieve. He was governor from 28 to 32, and they were 2-year terms. But what he wanted to do was reform and improve the conditions in New York prison systems. So he would say, as they pulled up to a prison, he would say, look, Babs, and this is when the story comes from an inspection of a kitchen at Sing Sing, and he'd say, Babs, as he called her, you can't just accept the printed menu for inmates. You have to lift the lid on those pots, stir it around, and make sure they're getting a decent soup. So, lesson learned. I mean, and she really did this a lot for him because he obviously couldn't leave the car. So she would be making these inspection tours and would report back to him. So fast forward to the first months in the White House when the World War I bonus marchers were encamped at the Anacostia Flats. So without going into the details of the bonus marchers who were veterans and who deserved their bonus, suffice it to say that Herbert Hoover, who was still president, this is towards the end of his one term in the White House, handled the debacle with the aide, I want to say in quotation, he wasn't General MacArthur yet, but his chief of staff or something. But anyway, it was a PR debacle for Hoover. And it was one of the things that really sealed the whole question of whether FDR would win. So he didn't want this disaster for him as well, because the bonus marchers drifted back into D.C. So he said to Louis Howe, who was his advisor still, Louis, you and Eleanor go over there and try to straighten that out. So Louis just goes off, no Secret Service, they go off. Now he's an old and frail man by this point, so how he would function as a bodyguard anyway, nothing happened. They pull up to this encampment of hundreds of tents, and he directs her, said, just go out and have a chat with them, just go talk to them. So he falls asleep in the car. She wades along alone through the mud, introduced herself to all those lined up in the camp's kitchen, ate beans off a tin plate, sang lots of old war songs, which she knew very well from her days of volunteering, and with them, and promised, and this was the thing that she had come with something, she promised that they'd be the first to get Civilian Conservation Corps jobs, which in fact happened. So that was a big... it was a mollifying thing, and it also gave them a sense of security about what was going to happen. The New York Times and Washington Star's headline read the next day, Hoover sent the troops, FDR sent his wife. At this juncture, and on a more personal note, I'd like to share a couple of, I think, sweet photos that demonstrate a bit of my mother's childhood during the first 2 to 3 years at the White House. This has been 33 to about 36. So this is photo number 2 now, Walter. And actually, this is taken up at Hyde Park because I can see the banister in the background. And my grandmother is there with my uncle, who has passed away, and Sarah Delano, of course, is on the left. And Camp David, of course, didn't exist at this point, so FDR's main source of getting away from Washington was to go to Hyde Park, and his mother lived to 1941. So when this photo was taken, my grandmother's probably about to ask for a divorce, and in fact, that was the main reason she moved into the White House with her children. Photo number 3. In this next image, Eleanor is dressed for one of her weekly rides in Rock Creek Park, which I find amazing. Somebody would wear a tie to go on horseback, but anyway. My mother, his sister, and her younger brother were clearly dressed for a photo op, as there were a lot taken on the same day. And they all seemed to have those same white berets on. So I don't know how they were, but same outfit, and there's about 20 of them. The First Lady stabled her horse at Fort Myers, and an Army cavalry sergeant would follow behind her at a discreet distance. But stop and think for a moment. I want you just to imagine any other First Lady before or since insisting on a regular physical outlet completely removed from her official duties. Presidents, by the way, as we all know, have always felt like, yeah, they can play golf once a week, whatever. Eisenhower spent more time on the golf course than he did in the White House, without a whiff of criticism. But for Eleanor, who escaped the grim childhood atmosphere of her grandmother's rural mansion in Tivoli, New York, walking or riding in the woods, these outings were really her main relief from the appeals of a lost and bereft American public. So she got, this is the first 6 months of the first administration. Sometime in that time point, she asked in a magazine, maybe Red Book, for readers to tell her, send her stories, share their stories and experiences. And of course, people would write then. And partly, one, she really wanted to know what people were experiencing. And secondly, she didn't want to become this ornamental fixture. And she wanted to really be able to talk about that with American public. So the upshot was that in the first 4 months of the first administration, more than 300,000 letters arrived in the first 4 months. Many of them asking for help. My children have no shoes. Many of them ask for clothes to be sent back to them, that maybe, Sisti isn't using her coat anymore. Her pattern was to try and answer 50 letters each day, which reminds me of Obama's. He had a thing where he would answer 10 letters, if you remember that. But anyway, she had her formulaic thing. She would try to get through this, often after midnight, using a dictaphone. Many letters, or some, I should say, were extremely critical, especially as time went on. Most criticism had to do with her gadding about and never being at the White House. And it's basically forgetting her role as a proper wife. So, Walter, if you could show cartoon number 1. So I love this one because it's not, this is, Hoff is a famous cartoonist for the New Yorker. And it says, well, good evening, Mrs. Roosevelt. So, and he has his apron on, and he's clearly doing what she should be doing. And that's what will become, how many of you will become a house husband if your wife listens to the First Lady too much. So it is just it's just very funny. So the next one is the John Gardner cartoon. Yes, okay. So this one was such a favorite of Eleanor's that she actually asked for the original from the artist. And she got it, and for some reason an archivist would shudder. It ended up in the Truman Library. So I know how that happened. She left the White House in 1 week in 1945, and I think the records just, what was left behind or missed was sent on. This is actually some truth to the title. It's hard to read, but the title says, "But it would make such a nice scoop if you'd tell me, Franklin." And there's some truth to this. He was known to ask her to suggest an idea, just some policy, something to do with helping some group in her My Day column, which started, so this has to be after 1935, because that's when she started those. And to see what the written comments were, because people were always saying, I don't understand why you're doing such and such somewhere. And so this is a way to kind of test the waters. It was like a sort of informal polling that was going on. She felt also like she was helping the greater cause of the New Deal, and it was a break from running through her daily log of visits and travels. And I want to say now for a favorite little story told in my mother's voice, this is a recollection she gave in a recent oral history with the head of the Living New Deal Project, which I can talk about later. So she said to him, I was very fond of my grandfather. We called him Papa, and he was wonderful with us. When Buzz, this is her younger brother, and I lived in the White House, he would spend about 10 minutes with us each morning, reading the cartoon strips as we snuggled up to him. newspapers. He'd already read all the newspapers, and they'd be scattered around the bed. And he'd ask about our plans for the day as he had his breakfast. At some point, a Secret Service agent would pop his head in to remind me that it was time to head over to Beauvoir. I remember Papa reading the story of Scrooge from Dickens' A Christmas Carol on Christmas Eve, every Christmas Eve, to a dozen of his grandchildren sitting around him on the floor. But on a more serious note, my mother, Ellie, commented that her grandmother was always careful to remind them that they lived in the people's house. And this is something I've read from other first ladies, too, with children, or, in this case, it was grandchildren. But in a unique way, though, at this time period, when you think about the level of, housing is still bad in Washington in many places, but around Capitol Hill, I'm told that there were some really slummy neighborhoods. So as a way to show them that most people don't live in big houses like this, she would, because I think kids came to them, they didn't go to other kids, so it was isolated. She would from time to time pile them into an unmarked car with a Secret Service agent, and they'd take long forays, this is at night, into neighborhoods near the White House, where indoor plumbing was a rarity and privies were in the alley. And, I first heard this story, my reaction was to say, well, this sounds a little like voyeurism. But the images, and I grew up in some rural areas in upstate New York, where when you see how other people live, you never forget that. And they really stuck with my mother, who was old enough to understand Eleanor's explanations about why people and how people could live in housing like this. Once the war began, it was a long time before Eleanor found new ways to become a useful partner. The New Deal, which she had sort of wrapped her schedule around to some extent, had petered out. So a couple things she did. One I don't have in my written up script here, but one of her main things that I think was most important to the country were her trips to visit troops. And she logged tens of thousands of hours visiting troops in the Pacific Islands. And this started out actually in Great Britain, in England, where she was, talking to troops that were already over there. But the other thing, and this gets back to 1941 and the State of the Union address, that was the famous Four Freedoms speech. And she had a lot to do with how that was going to be shaped up. And the two of them worked on this together. And it was based on their wish, their joint wish, because they were already planning for the post-war period, for an organization that would not meet the fate of the League of Nations. And in fact, informally, it was already called the United Nations. She sometimes escaped to Seattle, Washington, where my grandmother was co-editor. There's a photo of the two of them out on the Puget Sound, Walter. Yeah. So that's they're on a boat that they had friends with a boat, and that's my grandmother at this point. I regret to say smoking, as many people did back then. I probably don't need to say anything to this crowd about Eleanor Roosevelt's role in shaping the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this fall, organizations, including the one that I'm helping out now, will mark its 75th anniversary. And now for the 1950s, if we can bring that up, that would be fun. And a video clip from Meet the Press with Eleanor warning her audience about Richard Nixon. So, okay. We'll get back to that. Maybe we should. Well, we'll just talk about it. You're right. Yeah, if you have. Yeah. Okay. That's okay. While you're doing that, this is just a letter I included. There's a letter that I just. Oh, there we go.
Chair would look great.
I know you have to watch these ads before.
Well, you should definitely see how Geico could.
And it's always something. Okay, at least it's an entertaining ad, right?
Yeah, $2 for the chair.
Two? That's a Victorian antique.
Victorian antique.
Geico.
Will you tell us how you feel about Mr. Nixon running as he is for vice president?
Can you turn it up?
Yes, I know how I feel personally, but I know that what I feel personally is probably a feeling that might not be shared by other people. I'm told that Mr. Nixon is a very fine young man by many Republican people whom I know, particularly young people, and that he has matured and grown in many ways. I happen to remember very clearly his campaign for the senatorship. I had no respect for the way in which he accused Helen Hagan Douglas of being a communist, because he knew that was how he would be elected. And I have no respect for the kind of character that takes advantage and does something they know is not true. He knew that she might be a liberal, but he knew quite well, having known her and worked with her, that she was not a communist. And I've always felt that anyone who wanted an election so much that they would use those means did not have the character that I really admired in public life.
Well, Mrs. Roosevelt, did he actually accuse her in that campaign of being a communist?
Yes, he did.
And this is just, we all know how that story turned out, right? This is just a letter I included. It's one I have from my mother's records. But she taught, this is from probably 56 or 7. Her handwriting was terrible. And one of my mother's jobs in high school was to sort of read all her correspondence and type up replies for her. And she said, I was very excited. I had a job that paid 25 cents an hour, and I was thrilled. But she talks also about she got an attack of flu or pneumonia, and she's so exhausted. And she, but she just kept going. She was, I think, campaigning for Adlai in this, and I think this is Adlai in there, and she talked about making a campaign stop for him in Passaic, New Jersey, and then puts in parentheses on the next page, I must be crazy to be doing all of this. So I think she knew this is the second attempt wasn't for Adlai Stevenson, unfortunately wasn't going to work either. So before I end this, I want to return to my great-grandmother's last appearance here at the club in 1959. And I have a recording somewhere, but we've moved and I can't find the CD. But I have it, Judy, somewhere. I'm on record as saying I will find it. Anyway, so she was running late for a lunch talk here, and she came straight here from the air shuttle from LaGuardia, which was the final leg from a trip back from Iran and Israel. And she was in Iran because my grandmother was living there with her husband at that point. And she went to Israel many times in the 50s because she was busy raising funds for them with Danny Kaye. So I listened to it, the CD recording. I thought, this doesn't sound very organized. And, you have this concept that she was always spot on and never wandered. But my mother's response, as she listened to it, was to say, by this time in her life, she was so tired, and she often just would go barging. She'd be asked to speak somewhere. She'd just go in and tell them kind of like a verbal version of my day. But in this case, she talked actually a lot seriously about the lack of civic society in Iran. And because she'd been in both countries at the same time in Israel, she said, this is a country that's clearly building on an organized basis. And Iran doesn't seem to have much civic sort of infrastructure, and she lamented that. So it was about that. My last recollection as a child was to watch her when, this is the late 50s now, when we were up at Valkill for our usual summer week. And I stood at the bottom of the stairs, and I just watched in just a kind of sense of awe that this person pulled herself up the narrow stairs to her upstairs sleeping porch, and being shocked, of course, as a child, how difficult a simple climb could be. A few months later, around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, she passed away. To close, I'd like to quote a short outtake from the last book she wrote, Tomorrow is Now, which is Penguin has the printing privileges, that would remind her readers that she did not lack for a sense of humor, because she was always pretty serious, but she had a good sense of humor. It seems appropriate in today's climate in that it deals with the Russians. So, let's see. She's talking about when she was, an amusing occurrence, she says, that happened on a recent July 4th, and this would have been probably the mid-50s. I was asked to receive the Soviet cultural attaché in his party at Hyde Park. I pointed out that the visit would take place on the July 4th, but I was assured that this did not matter. I followed the custom of many years. There was a picnic for all the young people, and after lunch, I read aloud the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, explaining the background and the reason for each of these safeguards to our personal freedoms. I was aware that this could not be very palatable to my Russian guests. Later, they asked to visit the FDR library, and we started out in my car. To begin the dangerous part of the trip, I think. I'd forgotten the annual July 4th parade in Hyde Park, so we were held up at a crossroads while it passed. The Russians had been indoctrinated, of course, with the image of a warmongering America. So on this, our great national holiday, they apparently expected to see such a display of military strength as they might be seen on a national holiday in the Red Square. A group of people went by in uniform. Military? My guest asked. Boy Scouts, I explained. Another group marched by in uniform. Military? They asked again. The volunteer fire department, I said. At length, the car went by. 4 middle-aged war veterans who had been stuffed into uniforms they had long grown too stout to wear in comfort were driven past. Military, I said. So now I'll take questions if anyone has them, or time for a throat lozenge. Turn the button on the button. There's a button there.
I'm going to get us started.
It sounds like, since this is Women's History Month,
And it sounds like, thank you, your great-grandmother either advertently or inadvertently was creating a network of women by the time when she was initially starting to get into her activism, as well as much later in life, from even using her own family, and it sounds like the women in her family, and giving them opportunities to as the later part of her life. Do you think that was specific? Was she specifically trying to build that network, or was that just what was available to women kind of at that time, not being able to get into the political world of the men in her family?
I don't, the women in the other women members of the family, on the TR side at least, and that's where the FDR side did not have women who would have been helping her in that. And the TR side, it was, except for Bammy, for TR's sister, there really weren't other women involved in politics. I think her networking came from, women she met here at the club, women in New York State especially, Molly Dewson. There were people, I'm sure she met Frances Perkins at that point. There's at least a dozen women, Esther Lape, Marion and Nancy, I've already talked about them, but many of these women actually were involved in starting up the New York division of the national, the women's division of the Democratic Party was a major force, I think, in bringing together women who would then played a role later on in the 30s in the New Deal. I think it was an organic process in the 20s, her networking with people here and in New York, and sort of being aware of how we were building bridges. But it was a fairly slow process, but she didn't get much help from the family. In fact, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who lived until, she lived an awfully long time. Yeah, yes, I agree. No, but she was really, and I think that was one of the reasons I didn't get into it, in terms of retribution against TR Jr. Alice was really awful in terms of promoting that affair. She was the Mercer situation. She was delighted that this was happening, and I know that Eleanor was aware of that. I mean, the stories came back to her. So there was just not only this issue about the political split in terms of the party, there was a personal split too. But I don't, and there were a few other women who were vaguely politically involved in terms of the family, but it was mostly women she met here and in New York who were the ones who said, this is something we need to do, and we need you as the wife or somebody whose husband is getting back into political office. We need you to be out there talking to groups and encouraging women, and so I hope that answers the question.
How did she promote the affair?
Alice?
Yes.
She encouraged them on outings. She would take them places, out Lucy at Mercer, and she just and she gossiped about it all over the place, so everybody knew about it. It was humiliating. So, to have your dirty laundry aired that way in public, and she was not a nice person. And never did not improve with age.
Do you want to tell, speaking of young women, would you like to talk about the Eleanor Roosevelt Center and what you're working on there?
Yeah, so ERVK has had, if you go on the website now, we still have 2 programs. In fact, there are 3, but mainly the 2 main programs that we fundraised around were Girls Leadership Worldwide, which was basically bringing groups of young women all under the age of 18 to Valkill, and we had leadership training exercises, leadership training, that kind of thing. It's a great program. It was a great program. We have some alumni that still write to us and say, this is what I got out of it, how much this affected me, how much it benefited me, especially during the time when there weren't that many girls' programs like that. And then in the 90s, I started noticing, that didn't equate it to what ERVK was doing, that there were a lot more, like Girls Gotta Run. I mean, there's a lot more of them out there. The big problem was insurance. We were running essentially a camping program. We had to buy campers insurance. In fact, I have to go back today and change the policy. So the insurance costs, and next time you send a grandchild to camp, you'll understand why you're paying so much, or whatever. I shouldn't say grandchild. But so that, and then the pandemic basically brought that to a halt. We're going to do something similar, but it has to be reformulated in a way that does not involve the ERVK being in loco parentis. So that's the next thing we have to do. The other thing was Dutchess County. We were working with the community colleges in leadership training for young adults. These would be people in their 20s going back to school, often from families where leadership models were not in front of them all the time. So, how to do things that would get you to the next point where you don't have those family models perhaps in front of you, or family connections. So I thought that was an incredible, I want to go back and do that again, but now there's declining, as all of you know, declining enrollment in colleges everywhere. So the state of New York decided to cut the funding from their community colleges to some extent. So that as a grant source has been stripped away. So that's another thing we have to reinvent. And the 75th anniversary is coming up, so yes, we're doing programs around that in partnership with the National Park Service. And but we're in the middle of hiring too, so it's a really, we're paddling very quickly right now to do a lot of different things on different fronts. But if you go on the net, there's the Eleanor Roosevelt Partnership, which is a different nonprofit. We are the Eleanor Roosevelt Center at Valkill. So I just wanted to point that out, because that's one of the first things I want to deal with, is that confusion when we get our staff back in line.
Hi, thanks. So delighted that you're here, and it's amazing to hear firsthand your experience in this incredible family. That picture of your mother and your uncle with Eleanor Roosevelt, I've never seen that before. Oh. That's your mom.
Yeah.
And she's still with us. Would that have been around 1933, 34, 35? Your mom would have been 7 or 8?
Right, yeah. It's about 34 probably.
So I have a two-part question, kind of, what is it like growing up in a family that, you know, some of the most famous people of the 20th century who did, and so there are biographies. One that I've read that I love is No Ordinary Time by, you know, Doris Kearns Goodwin.
Yeah.
Is there one that the family thinks is more accurate than the other? And then my second question is whether you know it's true, that if it's true that Alice Roosevelt Longworth said, if you don't have anything nice to say, come and sit next to me.
Well,
It could have been true, right?
Well, that's funny because I remember, I'll answer that question last because I remember this when it was in the, those of you who really go back, remember when the style section was called For and About Women? So it may have been around that time, and they did an interview with Alice, and she actually had a picture, I think, of this pillow. Yeah, and so she was quite proud of this pillow. She thought this was very funny. And there was another thing about her being the oldest topless octogenarian. No, she had a mastectomy, so that was quite okay. Well, I mean, and I have to say, she was brave because she talked about something that people weren't supposed to talk about. But everybody got the joke because somehow, you know, you knew that she'd had breast cancer. But so she had a sense of humor. It's just that she was a very, very smart person who it always bothers me that when people like that have those talents and that background and those connections and the money, and then it's not used for any particularly good purpose. I just don't know what she did with her life, but she could have done so much. And anyway, so in terms of the books, so there's several books. I like No Ordinary Time a lot, but the one I think, and maybe this is just a sort of function of having read them in a certain order and at a certain time, I've always liked Joe Lash's biography because he doesn't David Michaelis wrote a very interesting book, and it's well written. And Blanche Wiesen Cook wrote those books too. I think it's just mistaken to, in terms of accuracy about things. People wanted to wade into the relationship between Le Hickok and my mother just rolls her eyes and says, "Well, who knows?" And and the other thing I just want to mention about that is that Eleanor had this need to return love to people who showed her love because it had not been something she'd grown up with. And she was always so sort of felt warmed in a psychological sense by people who showed her unconditional love. And so it was easy to sort of return that. I mean, she has a letter, it's in the Michaelis book, I guess, she wrote to Joe Lash, who wrote the first book, right? And she adored him, and her letters to him, she visited him when he was in Guadalcanal. He served in the Pacific. And I thought, wow, it sounds like she's having an affair with him. And of course she wasn't. And she also fell in love with her doctor, who was incredibly handsome, I have to say. So I can understand why. But so she really sort of fell in love with people who gave her the love she didn't have as a child. So I think those would be my favorite books, I think.
Hi, it's Pamela Johnson. Anna, that was fantastic to hear all of those stories. I have two questions, and I also have an invitation. I'm with the WNDC Educational Foundation, and we have an exhibit of the centennial of the Women's National Democratic Club on the second floor. There are so many amazing photographs of Eleanor Roosevelt. And you're welcome to go upstairs after lunch and see that if you'd like.
Yeah, good point.
One of the things that is particularly interesting, they're collages, basically, of each decade of the last 100 years. And actually, Charlotte Kroll and Judy Hubbard are responsible for that. But one of the most interesting ones is the Roosevelt administration. It's 32 to 42. And there are 25, 30 women who are going into government as the director of the Mint, as the, right. Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor. Mike, I have two questions. One, what was her role in relating and supporting these women coming into government at that point? And then also, she had extraordinary relations with the National Council of Negro Women and a number of African American organizations, Mary McLeod Bethune and Dorothy Height. Can you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, so I think one of the ways in which, and it's interesting because I've read in several places, one site said that there were more women in the 30s and they never achieved that same level in terms of senior management positions until the 1990s. Another source said the 1960s, which means sounds a little more realistic. I think it was her part of it, women coming into the New Deal in big numbers, was based on the nature of these programs that were being, the WPA and National Relief Administration and all the alphabet agencies, as we call them. Many of them required the repertorial skills and the communication skills that social workers, most of whom were women, reporters. I mean, Lorena Hickok was just one. She was the tip of the iceberg, and in fact, a good friend of mine is very proud and wants to come and talk to you all maybe about her mother, who was the lead reporter in the pack of women reporters. So, and she, don't forget, ER was getting to know all these women in the late 20s when FDR was governor. So part of, there's an interesting sort of relationship between his inability to get out because of physical limitations and her curiosity and her boundless energy. I mean, I talked about the TR relationship. You think about the most energetic president in modern history, if you go back to 1900, was TR. And it is kind of an inherited characteristic of her that she finally wore out. People have asked me what she died from, and it probably was tuberculosis. It was a very difficult to treat strain of tuberculosis. But until the late 50s, she was just going all the time. I think basically it was this network, Pamela, that had evolved, and she pushed these women. She was always talking to Franklin every day about, you need so-and-so, and she was friendly with Harold Ickes and Hopkins and all the people who are kind of shoving people into these hugely expanding network of government agencies. And you couldn't fill those positions fast enough. And FDR really didn't care. He just wanted good people. So that's, yeah.
Well, I'm David Ehrlich. We saw a wonderful program on public broadcasting a couple of years ago. It had involved the Crown Princess of Norway. Mm-hmm. Well, how much truth was there in it?
The Crown Princess? Truth what? About that there was...
Well, how true...
there was a relationship?
Well, what was true? It was a charming...
Yeah, no, I understand. There's no truth to that at all. No, but I mean, true. I guess there's some. This reminds me, just a personal anecdote. There's a horrible movie. I mean, just speaking about these things that have come out. I won't go into the okay, never mind. So Bill Murray was in a movie it's now like 6 or 7 years ago, called Hyde Park on the Hudson, something like that. Awful movie, filled with inaccuracy, but, it's fun. Anyway, I said something to a biographer who was here to present a book, and I was seated at the table with him, I won't name who it was, and complained about this movie. And he turned to me sort of snarkily and said, "The Kennedy family never would have let this happen." I said, "Really? We're talking about public figures here. Things happen. If you're a public figure, anything can be said about you, or your life can be depicted in any way." And so I think we do have this sort of fascination in this country, and maybe it's not just this country, it's probably everywhere. Yeah, that so-and-so had a relationship with, they came over here. In fact, I want to say, and Pamela wants me to say this, I'm thinking of you. So Florence Harriman, she was the envoy and the second one, not the first one, to Norway. And she was the one who got out all not only the royal family, and when the Nazis came in, and I think she had a few days to do this, and she got them all over here. The royal family had already gotten an invitation to come over because we knew what the Nazis were going to do. We knew what the time plan was roughly. So they may have come over here in advance. I'm not sure what the exact timeline was. But they had a house, a mansion, out in Pooks Hill Road, which is North Bethesda, and of course long since torn down. And he would motor out there to have tea with them or something like that. He did like to be. He was like to be around women, women who he could just chat with. I mean, it was, I think. This is this partnership thing, but the difficult part of the partnership for him was that Eleanor was always on his case about something. And by the end of the day, I mean, this is why he started the day with kids, because he could just go over cartoons, Katzenjammer Kids or something. Anyway, but he wanted to end the day with terrible martinis and attractive women who would tell him lots of jokes and have fun. It was just, but it was the idea that I didn't even know about that until recently. So I'm sorry if I seem a little.
I think we have time for one more question. I'm gonna.
There was Sunrise at Campbell. That was a good one.
Yeah, that was great.
Okay.
Yeah, that was incredible. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. This
Hi,
has been
Loretta.
great. Hi, I'm Loretta Newman, and I have 3 things. I'll be as quick as I can. First of all, in Valkill, I worked for a congressman in the 70s and met your mother's brother, Curtis Roosevelt.
Yeah.
Who came to the Congress with a staff person from Congressman Bingham's office about legislation to establish Valkill, and I was on the congressman's staff who dealt with parks, and I remember vividly the national parks people saying, "Oh, well, they're already covered. That's all up the Hyde Park. We already have that. We don't need Valkill."
Right.
And they didn't need a separate thing for her. Fortunately, we got it, but
Right.
I just remember it was a bitter battle for
It
quite
was
some
it was,
time.
and I hats off to my uncle for doing that because he really led the charge on it.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
He was a delightful man, too.
Thank you.
The second is about your mother, and you didn't mention, but she was a native here, too, in a way.
And she was a member of the club.
Member of the club of WNDC, but she also taught school here for about 30 years or something, she told me. So she, in terms of Washington, D.C., I mean, her heart was here, and
Yeah.
teaching children was so important to her.
Yeah.
She and I became really good friends because later, in about 2007 or 8 or 9, there was an opera written about Marian Anderson and the work that Eleanor did to allow, when DAR wouldn't let Marian Anderson sing at the DAR,
Yeah.
Eleanor got the use of the Lincoln Memorial. And so there's this opera called Let Freedom Sing, and it's about Marian Anderson, and it has a lot about your great-grandmother. And the librettist for that is one of our members, but I thought she'd be here today, but she's not. Carolivia Haran wrote the libretto.
Yeah.
Yes, but we had a big fundraiser because it was the purpose of this was for the fundraiser was to support saving the Tacoma Theater, and I'm past president of I am still president of the Tacoma Theater Conservancy, and we did save the theater. But anyway, so we had this program, and Ellie came, and she spoke about her mother and her grandmother driving Marian Anderson in her car, and Ellie was in the back seat, and her grandmother was driving, and Ellie and this poor Marian Anderson was scared to death because her driving was crazy. I think you alluded to the fact that she drove.
In fact, she finally her teeth, which never got fixed when she was a child, so there's always this buck teeth thing going on. Well, she had an accident at some point, and her teeth were all knocked out, the front teeth.
Oh.
So then her better teeth, or the ones in the older pictures, those are her whatever they did back then, but those were not her original teeth. But anyway, yeah, no, you're right. She would have this tendency to do this, and and drive with sort of, and she was trying to persuade Marian Anderson to give money to the Wiltwick School, which was across the Hudson. So you had to do the thing down to Poughkeepsie and across the river, and then down to the. And my mother said she didn't know they'd make it, and anyway. No problems there, but yes, it was not a good ride.
I want to end with one last question about legacy, because I think as Tim was asking before as well. So you come from the female line in the family, and you have a daughter. So is there a sense of having to pass this legacy on as to the next generation and what that might be?
Yeah, I think my daughter is a teacher at Walter Johnson and a history teacher, and so I think that we raised her right. She's a good Democrat. Sorry if it doesn't include everyone in the room, but I know this is an apolitical crowd. Anyway, I think I feel the legacy certainly do, and I think it's going to be one of these things. I'm going to have to work on her a little bit more, but she's also in a community orchestra, and teaching is obviously a busy job, and she does do student government association. She loves doing that, and one of the things about student government is to get kids to learn how to run things on their own, and do fundraising and be involved in school in a civic sense, helping to run the school. So it's too early to tell how she's going to, and my son is an interpreter for the Park Service. So in that sense, that's also the environmental aspects of FDR and TR's legacies are something that people don't think about. But David Brinkley, who's a big author, very famous historian, has written a lot about FDR and the establishment of so many of the parks that we enjoy now, especially state parks. So I feel there is a legacy to be handed on, and I just have to live long enough to make sure they live up to the standards.
I'm going to let Rick give our certificate of appreciation. As I know everybody is raring to go. It's going to be a nice day outside. Everyone's trying to get out. Next month, we have a speaker who's going to talk about her book on Eliza Skidmore, who helped bring the cherry blossoms to D.C. So come go see the cherry blossoms and then come hear about the cherry blossoms and how they were created in April. I want to thank Ms. Fierst so much for coming, and I think giving us more insight than you can get from some of those books that we all tend to read about it. So thank you so much.